Churchill didn't say that. The King's speech is riddled with gross falsifications of history. By Christopher Hitchens, January 24th, 2011. The King's Speech is an extremely well-made film with a seductive human interest plot, very prettily calculated to appeal to the smarter filmgoer and the latent Anglophile. But it perpetrates a gross falsification of history. One of the very few miscast actors, Timothy Spall, as a woefully thin pastiche of Winston Churchill, is the exemplar of this bizarre rewriting. He is shown as a consistent friend of the stuttering prince and his loyal princess, and as a man generally in favor of a statesmanlike solution to the crisis of the abdication. In fact, Churchill was, for as long as he dared, a consistent friend of conceited, spoiled, Hitler-sympathizing Edward VIII, and he allowed his romantic attachment to this gargoyle to do great damage to the very dearly bought coalition of forces that was evolving to oppose Nazism and appeasement. Churchill probably has no more hagiographic chronicler than William Manchester, but if you look up the relevant pages of The Last Lion, you will find that the historian virtually gives up on his hero for an entire chapter. By dint of swallowing his differences with some senior left and liberal politicians, Churchill had helped build a lobby, with strong grassroots support, against Neville Chamberlain's collusion with European fascism. The group had the resonant name of Arms and the Covenant. Yet, as the crisis deepened in 1936, Churchill diverted himself from this essential work, to the horror of his colleagues, in order to involve himself in keeping a pro-Nazi playboy on the throne. He threw away his political capital in handfuls by turning up at the House of Commons, almost certainly heavily intoxicated according to Manchester, making an incoherent speech in defense of loyalty to a man who did not understand the concept. In one speech, not cited by Manchester, he spluttered that Edward VIII would shine in history as the bravest and best loved of all sovereigns who have worn the island crown. You can see there how empty and bombastic Churchill's style can sound when he's barking up the wrong tree. Never forget that he once described himself as the lone voice warning the British people against the twin menaces of Hitler and Gandhi. In the end, Edward VIII proved so stupid and so selfish and so vain that he was beyond salvage, so the moment passed, or the worst of it did. He remained, what is only lightly hinted in the film, a firm admirer of the Third Reich who took his honeymoon there with Mrs. Simpson, and was photographed both receiving and giving the Hitler salute. Of his few friends and cronies, the majority were black-shirt activists like the odious, fruity Metcalfe. Royal biographer Philip Ziegler tried his best to clean up this squalid story a few years ago, but eventually gave up. During his sojourns on the European mainland after his abdication, the Duke of Windsor never ceased to maintain highly irresponsible contacts with Hitler and his puppets, and seemed to be advertising his readiness to become a puppet or regent if the tide went the other way. This is why Churchill eventually had him removed from Europe and given the sinecure of a colonial governorship in the Bahamas, where he could be well supervised. All other considerations to one side, would the true story not have been fractionally more interesting for the audience? But it seems that we shall never reach a time when the Churchill cult is open for honest inspection. And so the film drifts on, with ever more Vaseline being applied to the lens. It is suggested that, once some political road bumps have been surmounted, and some impediments in the new young monarch's psyche have been likewise overcome, Britain is herself again, with Churchill and the King at Buckingham Palace and a speech of unity and resistance being readied for delivery. Here again, the airbrush and the Vaseline are partners. When Neville Chamberlain managed to outpoint the coalition of the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and the Churchillian Tories, and to hand to his friend Hitler the majority of the Czechoslovak people, along with all that country's vast munitions factories, he received an unheard-of political favor. Landing at Heston Airport on his return from Munich, he was greeted by a royal escort in full uniform and invited to drive straight to Buckingham Palace. A written message from King George VI urged his attendance, "so that I can express to you personally my most heartfelt congratulations. This letter brings the warmest of welcomes to one who, by his patience and determination, has earned the lasting gratitude of his fellow countrymen throughout the empire." Chamberlain was then paraded on the palace balcony, saluted by royalty in front of cheering crowds. Thus the Munich sellout had received the royal assent before the Prime Minister was obliged to go to Parliament and justify what he had done. The opposition forces were checkmated before the game had begun. Britain does not have a written constitution, but by ancient custom the royal assent is given to measures after they have passed through both houses of Parliament. So Tory historian Andrew Roberts, in his definitely damning essay, The House of Windsor and the Politics of Appeasement, is quite correct to cite fellow scholar John Grigg in support of his view that, by acting as they did to grant preemptive favor to Chamberlain, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, Colin Firth and Helena Bonham Carter to you, committed the most unconstitutional act by a British sovereign in the present century. The private letters and diaries of the royal family demonstrate a continued, consistent allegiance to the policy of appeasement and to the personality of Chamberlain. King George's forbidding mother wrote to him, exasperated that more people in the House of Commons had not cheered the sellout. The king himself, even after the Nazi armies had struck deep north into Scandinavia and clear across the Low Countries to France, did not wish to accept Chamberlain's resignation. He, quote, told him how grossly unfairly he had been treated, and that I was genuinely sorry. End quote. Discussing a successor, the king wrote that, I, of course, suggested Lord Halifax. It was explained to him that this arch-appeaser would not do, and that anyway a wartime coalition could hardly be led by an unelected member of the House of Lords. Unimpressed, the king told his diary that he couldn't get used to the idea of Churchill as Prime Minister, and had greeted the defeated Halifax to tell him that he wished he had been chosen instead. All this can easily be known by anybody willing to do some elementary research. In a few months, the British royal family will yet again be rebranded and relaunched in the panoply of a wedding. Terms like national unity and people's monarchy will be freely flung around. Almost the entire moral capital of this rather odd little German dynasty is invested in the post-fabricated myth of its participation in Britain's finest hour. In fact, had it been up to them, the finest hour would never have taken place. So this is not a detail, but a major desecration of the historical record, now apparently gliding unopposed toward a baptism by Oscar. Thank you for listening.